When most of us picture the First World War, we see the same archival loop: distant, jerky figures moving in high-speed, black and white static. That frantic pacing is an artifact of early, hand-cranked cameras. It creates a psychological wall between us and the past, making the soldiers look like alien figures rushing to their deaths, completely masking the reality of what they were walking into. For decades, popular history leaned heavily into a narrow narrative where passive men sat in the muddy trenches of France, waiting to be shelled or gassed. That localized view shrinks a vast catastrophe down to a single patch of European mud. Correcting that perspective has taken over 50 years of cinematic archaeology, beginning with monumental oral histories like the BBC's 1964 broadcast, right up to modern digital restorations that carefully speed-correct and colorize the original frames. Restoring the original frame rate pulls back a curtain. It exposes the forgotten truth of the catalyst that set the entire 20th century in motion. Look closely at the faces staring back from the front lines. They weren't passive victims waiting for the next artillery shell to land. They were teenagers living like hobos in flooded, freezing shell craters. We know exactly what they endured because early documentarians had the foresight to ask them. In the 1960s, hundreds of veterans, then still vital men in their 50s and 60s, sat in front of microphones to recount a daily existence of extreme boredom, punctuated by absolute mayhem. They recalled the terrifying, makeshift nature of survival, like strapping on these early, crude gas masks. They detailed the specific miseries of their routine: marching in boots that didn't fit, adjusting to awful army rations, and the creeping threat of gangrene. When you clear away the fog of damaged film, the human aspect jumps out. You see them smiling, posing with captured helmets, showing a profound resilience in the middle of hell. They were highly adaptable, ordinary people, thrust into the worst conditions imaginable. Erasing the visual static finally allows us to look them in the eye. The long columns of European soldiers marching off to Flanders represent the popular view of the war, but the conflict moved far beyond the borders of France. This map shows the true, sprawling scale of the conflict. As the view pulls back from Europe, you can see troop deployments igniting across the Middle East, deep into Africa, and across the Atlantic Ocean. The great empires were cashing in their colonial chips. The Ottoman Empire summoned its populations to a holy war against Allied forces, while maverick commanders dragged British resources into grueling guerrilla campaigns across the African plains. The oceans became a frozen zone of unrestricted warfare. German U-boats enforced bitter blockades, strangling global supply lines and sinking both military and civilian targets without warning. From South Atlantic seas to the deserts of the Middle East, diverse populations from every continent were pulled into the firing line. The entire world was dragged into a single, interconnected disaster. All of this devastation traces back to the assassination of an obscure Austro-Hungarian heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. A local dispute in the Balkans activated a rigid web of treaties, pulling one nation after another into the fire. The old rules of engagement evaporated. The fighting expanded into the cities, and for the first time, factories, homes, and civilian populations became deliberate military targets in a state of total war. Back home, societies restructured entirely to feed the war machine. Thousands of women stepped onto factory floors to turn out millions of artillery shells, establishing a new industrial role that remained long after the armistice. The sheer economic and human strain fractured ancient empires. In Russia, the desperation of the front lines triggered a revolution that toppled the Tsar. Meanwhile, a hesitant, divided United States reluctantly entered the fray, emerging on the other side as a dominant global power. The loss of 10 million soldiers and 9 million civilians was a tragic waste of human life. But those deaths dismantled dynasties that had ruled for centuries, forging the fragile, modern geopolitical landscape we still navigate today. When the fighting finally stopped, the leaders who gathered at the Paris Peace Conference drafted a settlement that many nations found bitter and unworkable. The unresolved tensions of 1919 left Europe in a state of brittle peace. Within 20 years, these same fault lines would pull the world into a second, larger conflict. To understand that legacy, filmmakers have raced against time. By capturing the oral histories of the men who survived the trenches before they passed away, documentarians saved the most crucial perspective of all, the human one. Layering those vital, first-hand audio records over painstakingly restored digital footage provides a level of intimacy that static text often loses. We hear the terror, the boredom, and the humor directly from the source. Through the lens of documentary history, the men who fought the Great War emerge as recognizable human figures. Their humanity is secured, and they shall not grow old in our collective memory.